My original intention was to start having these conversations to become a better man. I wanted to understand who I was. I wanted to understand my purpose. I wanted to understand the why I got out of bed every morning. I wanted to understand my worth and my value. And as time progressed, there was an evolution that took place where a community started forming around me. That community didn't just remain within the United States, but it started expanding across the globe, really, for which I'm very grateful. One of the relationships that I developed was with a man named Todd Jarrett. And if you're unfamiliar with Todd Jarrett, I would recommend finding him on Instagram, following his content, really supporting what he does because him and I have had some great conversations. As a result of that conversation with Todd Jarrett, he introduced me to someone who was instrumental in his life. And that is my guest today. And so I am privileged and I am honored to have Mitch Hunter all the way from the land down under. So, Mitch, mates, I think that's how they call it in Australia, mates. I want to thank you
Exactly.
for your time and for joining the conversation.
No, well, thanks for reaching out, Stephen. I appreciate you having me on. And yeah, I know you guys have had some great conversations. So I'm looking forward to having a good chat with you. Yeah.
I never know where these conversations are going to go. Sometimes it's difficult to pick a starting point to see where the conversation is going to launch from. I'd like to ask just a little bit about your background. I'd like to ask what your background is and what is it that you do right now that has caused someone who is as good a friend to me as Todd to recommend you because you, my friend, came highly recommended and highly spoken of.
Well, that's great. Yeah, I have to thank Todd for that recommendation. Yeah, well, my background, it's been a bit of a lifelong sort of process where when I was really young, I started to have these kind of spontaneous mystical experiences, and they would be within the realms of everything that people would kind of tell stories about and write about, like different entities, ghosts, psychic elements and premonitions and all sorts of things that other people would witness around me as well. And that was going on for many, many years when I was younger, which the benefit out of it is it actually caused me to start meditating. So from the age of 7 years old, I started to meditate. And it was because of my mother. She just kind of recommended I should, do meditation to help deal with all these experiences that I was having. And that went on for a long time. I kind of rejected spirituality at first because I really didn't understand it and it was too overwhelming for me. And so I got to a point where I could kind of control my mind to be able to switch those experiences off. And then I really delved into science. And so I went off and became what you call in the States a physical therapist. I ended up, eventually doing a double master's degree. I was working towards a PhD and became a university lecturer at a university here in Australia. And I was a university academic for about 9 years. And somewhere in that point, I started, more thoroughly, got involved with a teacher who was linked to a particular Indian tradition. And I had a series of extraordinary experiences in India at a mountain called Arunachala, which transformed my inner experience to be in a state of silence, which was something that I'd read a lot about in the literature around meditation and spirituality. I mean, I was just absolutely lucky enough to come in contact with it and have it stabilize within me. And that happened in 2019. And so once that had happened, it kind of reshaped my life. And now I'm considered a mystic. So it's someone who is in direct contact with these things that are at the heart of spirituality. And I help people to make contact with that heart of spirituality through meditation. So that's pretty much what I do now. And I stepped away from being a university academic and now I do this full time, which was a bit of a leap of faith, but also there was enough momentum behind this stuff that I actually couldn't stop it from happening. I was working with students at the university and they would be coming up to me after lectures and asking what was going on with me, and they wanted to learn about what I had done because they just knew that there was something there that they couldn't quite put a finger on. So it's been a really wild journey. And like I said to you before, actually, there's a publisher that got in contact with me late last year and they're writing a book about it, which will be coming out towards the end of this year. So it's just, yeah, it's been a really, really strange journey that I feel so extremely lucky to have been given the grace of my guru, Sri Ramana Maharshi, who has kind of carried me through this process, which has been completely and utterly life changing, the most beautiful way that I could express.
Mm.
So it's a mouthful, but that's kind of what happened. It's been really remarkable. And, I'm just some guy from New Zealand originally, and I just was lucky enough to start meditating from such an early age that it enabled me to get in touch with these deeper aspects of things.
How would you define meditation? Because meditation is something that I think is spoken of in various different religions. Of course, I approach meditation from the Christianity perspective. How would you, in your experience, both your upbringing and your experience now, how would you define it?
Yeah, it's a training method. There's all these different methods from different religions and different spiritual backgrounds. But the function of it is it's a method to be able to enable us to experience reality more clearly. So it's a way of training your attention and training your awareness to be able to experience what's really going on instead of being caught in the illusion of what we think is going on.
Mm.
So that's
It's a
how
good
I like to define it, because people think that it's a way of getting calm, and it will make you feel more calm, which is nice. And people think it's a way of becoming more focused and more able to kind of harness your attention. And that does do that as well. But the most fundamental part of it is we're looking to try and experience the reality that we're in, to experience this reality as clearly as we can. And as you start to kind of touch on this reality in more detail, you realize that the way that we have considered and seen this life and lived in our life has been bunched on a whole bunch of preconceived ideas that are theoretical and not actually in reality. And as you get deeper into the reality that is actually here, you'll start to find that this reality is held within an experience of silent peace and love, which permeates the entire experience. And that is heading in the direction of our true nature. And so, a lot of traditions will talk about this sort of approach as being the end of suffering, because you start to realize that these elements that we have difficulty with are happening within us. And as we see through them more clearly, we get in touch with this deeper reality of, causeless joy, which is within the entire experience.
When I think of meditation, I look at it as both an art and a practice. I look at it as something that has different components. I think two of the greatest components that I have come to understand with it in my own life is silence and breath and the link between both. I don't think we can have a conversation about meditation without understanding both the silence aspect of it and the breath aspects. Mitch, what I would like to ask you is I want to touch on those individually. I want to touch on the silence aspect of it too, because when I think of meditation, whenever I've engaged in it myself, I think of it as a way of quieting myself, quieting my mind, coming into a place of rest, a place of peace, a place of calmness, a place of stillness, especially when we are surrounded by so much noise and so many voices. It can become sometimes incredibly difficult to sit in that silence. A lot of people, in my opinion, are afraid of that silence. But I'm beginning to understand that it's oftentimes in the silence, it's in the stillness where we can see the clearest and when we can hear the best. So, how important is the silence component when you're talking about meditation?
Well, I agree with you. Yeah, for sure. I think it's extremely important. And the interesting part about that is that if you sit and you try and make yourself silent, then this isn't going to happen. So what this is trying to highlight is that there is something underneath that is silent, and our resistance to what is happening within these experiences is the thing that actually pulls us out of that silence. It's really interesting to note that you can be in a loud room, you can have lots of noises and people and things happening around you. Your mind can be very busy and thinking a lot, and yet where you really are, is completely silent. So I think this is the element of silence that's really important for people to start to kind of touch on it. And you have moments where everything becomes quiet and you can feel that there's a background silence in there, but if you kind of consider where you're having your experience from, that place where you actually are is silent. So this is a very can be a very tricky concept for people to kind of recognize. I'm not saying where you are in terms of sitting in a room. I'm not saying where you are geographically or anything like that. I'm saying if you consider your experience, the experience that you're having right now, and you kind of look towards where you're having that experience from, what that will highlight to you is that you'll realize that you're not having it from the room that you're in. You're not having this experience from the sounds and the sights and the tastes and the smells. You're actually having the experience not even within the mind, it's something that is receiving these experiences. And when you draw your attention back to there, that place is silent. And
Mm,
it's very restful because we never have moments where everything quiet is down for us. And I don't think I think living in the world we won't. There's
yeah,
always some change happening in life. Like, that's what's nice about life. It's constantly in a state of change. And that's the
yeah.
same, our mind is a direct reflection of our life. So in Buddhism, they'll talk about right ingestion, and that means that you want to ingest, you want to take in the things very carefully because whatever you take in is going to form your mind. And that's TV and phones and food and everything else. So our mind is a direct reflection of our environment. And what that is highlighting there is that it's going to constantly change and constantly be bringing out new things. So we can't expect for the mind or an environment to be silent and peaceful and still and comfortable all the time. And then that recognizes that we're not going to go searching for the silence within our mind or within our experience externally. We've got to go deeper inside ourselves to find this place that is unchanging.
If I'm hearing you correctly, silence, peace, rest, stillness, calmness, however we want to describe or define it, is something that we carry with us. It's something that we can transport with us. It's somewhat of a lifestyle where we can be in a crowded room, we can be in the middle of chaos, we can be in the middle of turmoil, and yet we can experience that silence. We can experience that stillness almost as if we're carriers or vessels of it. Because to your point, it is incredibly difficult to silence the world. I think if we were trying to silence the world, it'd almost be as impossible to try and capture the ocean in a drinking glass.
Yeah.
Is impossible to do because we are going to be surrounded by noise. We are going to be surrounded by voices, especially in the age of technology where social media reigns supreme and a lot of people are relationally overexposed and emotionally underdeveloped. And it's so much easier to become exposed relationally on an even greater level, perhaps even than what we're capable of doing because of social media. And now, as a result, a lot of us are living with so much noise within and noise without. And that's one of the things that I am realizing is that sometimes the strongest man in the room, sometimes the most powerful man in the room is not the loudest. Is not the one that has the most charisma, is not the one that has the most boisterous personality, but it's the one with the calmest heart rate. It's the one that really understands his breath. Everyone would like to look at the person that's the center of attention, that is in the thick and in the throes of conversation and communication. And yet sometimes the strongest person is the one that is at peace with himself because there is no striving. There is no performing. He knows who he is. He understands his purpose. He understands his value. He understands his worth. And I think those are things that can only be understood when we understand that silence is both an experience and a lifestyle. Would you agree with that statement that silence as we would understand it is both an experience but also a lifestyle in that we can be silent, we can be quiet, we can be peaceful wherever we are even if it's completely chaotic.
Yeah, yeah, I like that idea. I mean, what you're highlighting there is that we have our own internal sovereignty. We have the capacity to build our own internal state to be at ease for what we're actually looking to how we're looking to live our life. And I think that's really important to kind of highlight there, that there is ways of training yourself so that you can be in the crowded room and internally you can be at ease within yourself. I think this is the whole game of it, like if you think about what you're really looking for in your life, and you can ask this of almost anybody, it comes down to a feeling within ourselves that everything's okay. It's this thing that we're all kind of chasing, that we're like, I just want to feel like it's all okay, that it's all going to be okay. And we externally change our circumstances to try and find the answer to that. And we'll have brief moments where we touch on that feeling. But if we recognize where that feeling is occurring, it's occurring within us. So to touch on your point of, the guy in the room whose heart rate is the most calm, you're kind of highlighting that the value of someone feeling comfortable in their own skin can't be overemphasized. It's and I completely agree with that. The people that I have come in contact with two enlightened beings in my travels, and both of them were completely beyond being comfortable within their own skin. Being comfortable within their own skin was a good starting point, and then it went a lot further than that again. Because it's something that once you realize the capacity of what we can do within ourselves, then yeah, we kind of recognize its value a lot more. I know for me, like growing up, I live I'm from, Christchurch in New Zealand. It's a very kind of conservative, practical, no bullshit sort of place. Um, and growing up, I was raised in a way that was very pragmatic and very practical. The function and the outcome of what you're doing was the most important thing. Make sure you get a good job, make sure you get, good grades in high school, and make sure you're playing sports really well and all these sorts of things, which was good because it meant that, you can achieve well. But the piece of the puzzle that I didn't find this until I was in my 20s, was that my internal state while I was doing those things was actually more valuable than the external things that I was doing. Because I realized that a lot of my life was starting to kind of pass me by, and I had achieved a whole lot of things. I've always been a high achiever, but while I was achieving those things, I wasn't in a coming from a place that I was really enjoying my life. And once you recognize that these external things don't necessarily create that internal enjoyment, then it's like, okay, cool. It's going to be an internal game from here on, and to try and find this contentment and the sense of ease within myself. So yeah, I mean, I think that's extremely important. I'm sure for you, Stephen, you've probably touched on moments where you've felt this internal ease, and for you, it's been, those are some of the most important moments of our life. And the thing that happens is the internal. I can tell you many stories of like some of the most profound, beautiful moments. One in particular, I was sitting in India on a gutter, you know, in the street, and it was one of the most beautiful moments I'd ever had in my life, and
Mm.
more valuable to me than when I had achieved the different degrees that I got, or when I got my university position, or anything like that. These internal states were much more valuable.
I was having a conversation with Todd, and it was actually in our last recording. And he made a statement that I thought was incredibly profound. And he said, community reveals and solitude heals. And I thought it was incredibly profound because we oftentimes learn in community what we are unable to learn in solitude. But then we take what we've learned, we take what's been revealed, whether it's our triggers being activated, whether it's our nervous system being activated, whether it's our emotions coming online in an even greater capacity, they're all internal signs. They're guideposts that point us to something inside of us that needs to change, something inside of us that needs to grow. And it's that solitude where we are able to experience healing. I would like to highlight and underscore for anybody that would watch or listen to it that solitude and isolation are two drastically different things. Isolation can oftentimes be a self imposed prison that someone will put themselves in, where I'm convinced nothing ever gets accomplished when you isolate yourself. Isolating simply means that you're cutting yourself off from community and you're attempting to live life as a lone ranger. And I think that there's a connection between community and solitude, and that when we are willing to enter into that solitude, we are able to heal. Todd and I have talked extensively about healing, and I know Ryan Moresby White focuses a lot on healing. He focuses a lot on healing the boy, if you're a man, healing the girl, if you're a woman. And so, my question, and this is one of the things that I'm seeking to understand, is this connection between silence, whether it's an internal or external reality, and solitude, and how important solitude is, where we are willing to take what we've learned about ourselves in the company and presence of other people. We bring it into a place of solitude, and now we are able to sit in it. We're able to sit in it in our silence. We're able to sit in it even with our breath, and truly take the time to feel the feelings, understand our emotions, understand our thoughts, come face to face with who we are. And so, in light of everything that we've talked about, and in light of this concept of silence, can you talk about an apparent link or connection between silence and solitude, and how important it actually is for us to be willing to enter into that place where we are comfortable with being alone with ourselves? Because, Mitch, I think you and I would both agree there's a lot of people that aren't comfortable with being alone with themselves and by themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, well, the interesting part about that is that you already are. You already are alone with yourself. And it's just that because I agree with you, a lot of people have difficulty being with themselves, but the reality of the situation is the whole time you're there with yourself. You were there on your own. And what that is kind of showing is that because we have difficulty experiencing these things kind of internally of what's happening within our own environment, we'll seek to distract ourselves from the fact that we actually are alone. And this is at like the fundamental heart of what something like yoga is looking to try and resolve. There's this feeling that we're on our own and we're separated from everybody else. And because of that feeling of separation, because it's a very uncomfortable feeling, it's a very a confronting feeling to kind of explore. And you can even, within yourself, as we talk about these ideas, you can kind of feel that there's a real discomfort when you consider the idea that you are isolated and you are on your own. But by ignoring that idea, we seek to try and repair it by filling our life with all these things, all these distractions, all the stuff that we think is going to make us feel better. And those things are all good because you have to create a material world that you can live in, but a lot of people will use it to distract themselves from the fact of considering what their internal environment is actually doing. So, with that recognition, there's a lot of evidence to show that the reality that we're actually looking to kind of discover is this reality of union. We feel like we're completely isolated, so we seek these other things. But the reality is that we are isolated as one, and that one is the whole experience itself. So I'm not sure if that completely makes sense, but it's that idea that, by avoiding this internal experience of discomfort that we have, we seek all these external things. But if we're brave enough to be able to sit with our own internal experience, we will discover that there is union within our experience, that there is actual complete union with our entire experience, which is beautiful and completely fulfilling, and the thing that we've been looking to find the whole time. But people have to be brave enough to sit down, maybe in isolation, in solitude, and sit with themselves and consider what's actually happening within my own experience, which is a really useful gateway for a lot of people because, as you said, that's not a common thing that people will consider. They'll look to kind of satiate this feeling of separation externally rather than
Okay.
considering what's happening internally. Yeah, and I'm going down a particular pathway in how I'm describing this. My background is within Advaita Vedanta, so it's very much steeped within that tradition, but it's that kind of fundamental dissatisfaction that we're unwilling to sit with. It's like a good example is the idea of boredom. This is a really good analogy. With boredom, you'll sit there and you'll feel bored, and then you'll chase the next thing. You go, okay, well, I'm bored. I'm going to have to fill my time with something else. The interesting experiment is what happens when you feel bored and you sit there and you experience your boredom. and without restriction, you experience your boredom. Then you'll find that the boredom transforms because it's actually the resistance to the moment that you're in that is causing that agitation. But as soon as we accept the moment that we're in, accept the boredom, for instance, we'll see the deeper root of what boredom really is coming from.
Mm.
But you've got to get over that initial impulse to instead seek outward a solution, to consider what's happening internally, to consider why is this coming about? What am I experiencing here? And why is this happening? So yeah, I agree with what you're saying. I mean, I think it's challenging for people in this modern world to kind of even confront those ideas because we are so dependent on these external things a lot of the time to make people feel satisfied and satiated and carry them through their life. So when people feel like they don't have the capacity to look inward, a lot of self-compassion is really needed. That can be really helpful at the beginning because we're all in this human predicament that is actually really challenging. You know, like life, if you speak to, I would say almost everybody, they will say that life has been challenging. Life has been difficult and there's really unpleasant elements to life. So acknowledging that with some self-compassion can be really helpful so that people can then engage in this process of introspection.
You highlighted a couple of different realities, one of which you described of yourself, and you referred to yourself as having always been a high achiever. And in everything that you just described, you mentioned another reality that I think a lot of people do, whether consciously or subconsciously. I think a lot of people avoid. They avoid the difficulty, they avoid the tension, they avoid their emotions, they avoid their thoughts, they avoid their feelings, they avoid the introspection, the reflection that you spoke about. Mitch, I can't help but see sometimes a connection between achievement and maybe even high achievement and avoidance. And this is a conversation that Todd and I were having because if you look at someone, let's say Chris Hemsworth, who I believe is an Aussie. I could be wrong, but I believe Chris
Yeah, yeah,
Hemsworth
yeah.
is an Aussie. And if anyone is unfamiliar with who Chris Hemsworth is, he's simply Thor, the God of Thunder in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So if you've watched any of those movies, the Avengers or the Thor movies, you will understand exactly who Thor is. But Chris Hemsworth released a series on Disney called Limitless, and it's where he's challenging himself. It's where he's pushing himself beyond his limits, beyond his borders, beyond his boundaries, almost as if he has achieved so much in his life, especially in the entertainment industry. It almost seems when I watch Limitless, it almost seems that when I watch something like that, there is something that he's searching for. There's something that he's pursuing. There's something that he's maybe looking to find, whether it's external or internal, that his achievements could not produce. Give you another example. I watched a conversation with Will Smith when he was speaking with a Christian rap artist here in the United States, Lecrae. And he made the statement, I could do anything I wanted. I could go anywhere I wanted. I could buy anything I wanted. I had reached the pinnacle. I had reached the zenith. I had reached the top of everything that you could possibly want. I had a successful music career. I had a successful TV career. I'm having a successful movie career. And at the end of it all, I've come to a place where I've asked one simple question. Is this it? Is this all that life has to offer? And I think that there might have been this emptiness that was inside of him. And the reason why I mention all of that is because Will Smith has also been on a similar journey where if you go on Netflix, you'll find some specials where he's challenging himself and he's traveling the globe, going through all of these different experiences in order to find something. And I think what both Will Smith and Chris Hemsworth are ultimately trying to do is they're trying to find something within themselves. I think, and this is only an assumption, but I think that in the midst of all their achievement, there was an element of avoidance. And so I want to talk about that. I want to talk about the link between avoidance and achievement because I think so many times, whether you're an athlete, whether you're an entertainer, whether you're an entrepreneur, you can chase after so many external things. And in all reality, what you're really doing is coping with a lifestyle and with a part of yourself that is simply avoiding what you should actually be confronting.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I think that is a really, common sort of mechanism for a lot of people. And so I think you can kind of you can consider if you get the chance, and this is where it depends on people's propensity for this sort of thing. I remember when I got my job at the university, I'd worked maybe 15 years of my career at that point to get to this pinnacle. And I got the position. I started work on the Monday, and by the Thursday, I thought to myself, this was nice, but what's next? And it was really funny because there was a moment there, and the moment didn't last that long, but there was a moment for me to consider why had I gone after this university job in the first place?
Mm,
Um, and for me, I kind of like searched within myself and I found that I wanted to be special at that point. And when I was going through university, I had seen my university lecturers and they were very special people in my mind. And I thought, well, if I get to the point where I'm that special person and I'm that university lecturer, then I'm going to feel safe. And that was the thing that for me, really was a big thing because when I was younger, I'd had these very intense experiences, like different ghosts and entities and altered states of consciousness that for me as like a 7-year-old when it started were really scary. So I was very scared when I was younger and I really wanted to make sure that I felt safe. And so I felt like if I was a special person, then I would end up being safe. And so, hence I pursue this career and do all these things. But I got to that point where I had the job and it didn't satisfy that feeling. It didn't resolve the thing that I thought it was going to resolve. And I paused for a moment and then I thought, well, I could continue to do these other things in my career and I could become a better lecturer and I could become a more renowned academic, publish more papers and do all these sorts of things. Or I could pause and see what was the motivation behind why I was acting the way that I was. And I had to kind of confront this feeling of wanting to be special and ultimately kind of safety within myself. So I think that's one part of the puzzle, right? Unless you consider why you're doing the things you're doing honestly with yourself, you're going to end up perpetuating these kind of karmic patterns that have got us into trouble in the past. And this is why people kind of repeat cycles of suffering and so on. Um, and I think if you've got the capacity to do that, that's really good. But the flip side to that and the bit that has to kind of balance it out is the idea of self-acceptance. I have always been a high achiever, and I pretty much will always be a high achiever, and I can't help but want to do better, you know?
right.
And that's kind of I've tried many years to kind of pretend that that doesn't exist, once I've found this out. I pretended that I wasn't a high achiever and I was happy exactly where I was, but it's just not my personality. My personality is to constantly I'm very creative. I just want to express this in an environment that I kind of find myself within. So that means that I want to shape the world in a particular way. I like to paint. I like to do talks. I like to do all these different sorts of things because it's a way of me kind of expressing myself. I've had to come to grips with accepting my own propensity to achieve. And that's really nice because then I can say, well, you know what? Maybe I am good enough just the way that I am right now. And that self-acceptance can take away so much pressure and so much angst and so much guilt about being the particular way that we are because we've all kind of been handed our personalities. Our personalities were given to us. And it was given to us through our genetics, and then it was given to us through everything that happened within our life. And a lot of those things that happen within our life were outside of our control. And so these things that shape us, these forces that shape our mind and our personality, they've been handed to us. And yet we feel an internal sense of guilt and shame about who we are.
Mm.
And then if you have this moment of honestly kind of saying, well, this is who I am, that on its own can relieve a lot of the pressure and even undo a lot of these mechanisms of us chasing something to fulfill an inner need. So I think that's where it's that kind of nice balancing act where it's this idea of accepting the self and also recognizing what the inherent motivations are within ourselves.
Mm,
And that's nice because it means that we don't end up in a cycle of like um, blaming ourselves and chastising ourselves and feeling guilt and shame about who we are. You know, for so many years, I was so afraid and I felt so much shame around expressing my own spirituality and the experiences that I'd had since I was a child. I didn't talk about this stuff up until 4 years ago, 5 years ago. So, you know,
mm,
I was in my mid 30s before I started talking about this stuff because I felt so much shame and guilt that these experiences had happened to me, which you can imagine as crazy. It's like I was spiritually in the closet about a life that I didn't choose, it was handed to me.
mm.
So, yeah, I think that's where it's like I often come back to compassion, and self-compassion for so many people is such an antidote to the difficulties that we have.
Mm. You touched on a couple of different things, and you touched on one at the very end, but you talked about self acceptance, you talked about self compassion, but you also talked about something else that you mentioned a couple times, and it's the concept of safety. And I think that there's a link between acceptance of self, compassion towards and within oneself, and providing safety. So many times we focus on either needing or wanting to be safe for other people that we've neglected the reality that we need to first be safe for ourselves. And this is something that I have struggled with tremendously. I have perceived myself as potentially being empathetic or compassionate or kind or good or gentle. I focused so much of my effort and my attention trying, not always succeeding, but trying to be safe for other people that I never stopped to realize the importance of needing to be safe for myself. I think
Yeah,
I think if we're unwilling or unable to be safe for ourselves, then it's going to be incredibly difficult for us to provide safety for other people. And that's been my experience. I have been unsafe for others because I've been unsafe to myself. I've been unkind to others because I haven't been kind to myself. I have not been compassionate towards others because I haven't been compassionate towards myself. And there is a very real disconnect with that, that I am only now, after being alive for over 40 years, I'm coming to realize. And so, Mitch, the question that I have to ask is it's, I guess, twofold. What does it take to be safe for oneself? And what does that safety even look like? Because again, I don't profess to truly understand it. I am very much like you probably consider yourself to be a work in progress. So this is still something that I'm learning. But
yeah.
what does safety look like for ourselves first?
This is a great question, Stephen. Yeah, I really love this. So we can actually do an experiment with this, right? Because our fundamental nature, our true nature is safe. This is the premise that I'm going to propose, right? Let's say that we are already safe. What that means is that if we're already at that point of safety, our effort to try and become safe is an impediment to that. And this is one way of approaching it. This might not be for everybody, but I just have a sense that we can try this experiment so we can see what happens, right? As you sit there, you can say, okay, well, if I am already safe, I don't need to do anything. And so then you can kind of take a moment and you can internally recognize what you're doing right now. So internally in the body is a really nice place to start. You can, in your body, you can kind of stop making the next action. So, often people will find that even when they're in a situation, they're trying to do the next thing or they're trying to do something else. Just for a moment, see if you can stop the internal impulse of doing the next thing. And this takes no effort. So it takes no effort at all. It's actually removing any effort that was there. So then with no effort, you just kind of internally stop what you're doing. And then what you'll find is that you maybe the mind is still going to throw up different things, and that's fine. You're not trying to stop anything like that. But what you can do is you can stop the impulse to follow the next thought. because the next thought is again creating the next thing, creating it. So just for a moment, you just put everything down and you just stop and you pause and you just do nothing. And then what we're looking for is to see when I do nothing, what happens? What do you notice, Stephen? What happens when you do nothing?
In a way, it feels uncomfortable. In a way, there's this internal striving and chasing that I experience where almost instinctively I'm gravitating towards doing exactly what I didn't want to do, and that's pursuing the next thing.
That's all good. So let yourself do that and just let that happen without putting any effort into it. So if you want to pursue the next thing and it feels like it drags you to the next point, you can kind of let that happen just because it's an automatic process. These things are all automatic processes. And even if you feel uneasy in the situation, you can kind of let the discomfort or the unrest kind of stay there because we're not looking to change anything. As you do that, what happens?
There's a sense of peace, there's a sense of calmness, there's a sense of rest that I experience because I almost feel like I'm shutting something down and shutting something off.
So let the process happen naturally and you just keep on doing less. So you just keep on sitting there and let it roll however it rolls. And it's interesting because the thing that you've just done actually takes less effort. And what was revealed is more peace. Less effort, more peace.
Mm,
And then the interesting question that comes after that is, do you feel more or less like yourself now?
more like myself.
So this is very interesting because this is giving us direct evidence that our own true nature is grounded within peace. You start to feel more like yourself as you start to find more peace. And the way that you get there is by doing nothing. It's a trick, right? It's almost like a little scam. It's the little trick. And then you can kind of feel that there's this thing, maybe there's some stuff that's in resistance to it, and that's cool. You can kind of let them run and do their thing. But bit by bit, you get more familiar with the state of ease that's within us. So that's where
If
the idea of safety, this is where true safety comes from. True safety is a thing that is within us that we don't have to be good enough to achieve. We don't have to be special enough to reach it. We don't have to be perfect. We can be exactly as we are right now, and we are completely worthy of that feeling of safety. And we can let that safe feeling take care of us rather than us trying to cultivate or take care of it.
if we're naturally safe within ourselves or for ourselves, if we feel more like ourselves when we do exactly what you just described, if we experience a greater level of peace, then the natural question that I have is why wouldn't we want that all the time? And I guess taking it a step further is why then do we proceed to make ourselves unsafe? And so I guess my question is twofold. Number one, why do we proceed to make ourselves unsafe? And I guess a second part of that question is what then do we do to make ourselves unsafe? Because I think there's a why and I think there's a what. Why do I make myself unsafe? And then what do I do to make myself unsafe? And what does that actually look like?
Yeah, yeah. Well, what you're touching on, I can give you a superficial answer to that, but the deeper answer to that is the world of illusion. It is the world of Maya, which is at the heart of religion. You know, the within Christianity, you could call this the devil. You know, it's the idea of the veiling of our true reality, and that there's two forces within life. So, from the tradition that I come from, they say that God has five functions, and they are kind of categorized in these particular ways. The first is creation, that's Brahma. The second is maintenance, which is Vishnu, and the third is destruction, which is Shiva. And so those three things are kind of like the function that creates our reality. Within the reality that we experience, there are two aspects to it. The first is veiling, which is hiding us from the true reality. And the second is grace, which is revealing the true reality. So there's this constant dance between veiling and grace. Give us a little touch of reality, a little dose of illusion. What this is kind of highlighting is that this dance goes on moment to moment, veiling, grace, veiling, grace. And without that veiling and that grace, there would be no contrast. So the only reason that we can experience our life the way that we experience it is because of duality, hot and cold. Cold only exists because there is hot. Light only exists because there is dark. Without the contrast, these things wouldn't be there because we wouldn't be able to differentiate them. So for our life to exist, there has to be moments of getting caught and there has to be moments of freeing ourselves. So this is why we consistently find ourselves getting caught, and then we might find something that gets us uncaught for a few moments, and then we get caught again. What we're talking about is the fundamental reality that underpins that whole process, which is within a non-dual perspective. So duality is this hot and cold, black and white, left and right. Non-duality is neither and both. And that reality is the thing that holds this dualistic reality in place.
Mm,
So that's the answer that I have come across to the deepest degree that I can express it. And there's more superficial ways of considering it because you can talk about the world of karma and how we kind of perpetuate our own suffering and these sorts of ideas. But I think it's more useful to kind of see life as a dance, going back and forth between being caught and not being caught, because what that does is that takes away the sting of when we get caught. And if the sting of when I get trapped within my own mind is less and it causes me consider it to be less serious, then it causes me less suffering, it causes me less pain, which then enables me to actually get over that more quickly. So this is where within Advaita Vedanta Hinduism, they'll talk about the Leela. The Leela is the dance of reality,
mm,
or the dance of the physical plane anyway. The karmic plane, cause and effect. So yeah, and what we're talking about, Stephen, that there is, these are the big questions. These are the
mm,
big questions. Like these are the ones that humans have puzzled over since humans have puzzled.
mm. In the realm of Christianity, and particularly in light of scripture, there is a passage that I think perfectly describes what you just spoke of, the
Oh,
concept
cool.
of veiling versus grace. And the example is a man named Moses who went up to the top of a mountain and spent 40 days and 40 nights in the presence of God, talking with him, experiencing fellowship with him. And when he came down from the mountain, his face glowed, his face shone, his face radiated so much so that the people of Israel could not even look at him because of how bright his face was, because of this encounter, because he was reflecting the very image, the very likeness of God. He now had to cover himself, he had to put a veil over his face. And
Ah,
that was in history, and that was part of Jewish history for years until a man by the name of Paul wrote a letter. It was actually his second letter. I believe it was his second letter. And he writes something in, I believe it's the third chapter, and he speaks of the concept of freedom. And the way that he described it is there's a verse in the scripture, in this particular passage, that says, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. But where the freedom actually comes from and where the freedom actually is best understood is that when we are in front of other people, we have a veil that we wear. We have a mask, so to speak, that we wear to maybe conceal ourselves, to maybe hide versions of ourselves. But when we enter into the presence of God, the veil is removed and we no longer have to hide. We no longer have to conceal ourselves. And it's in that context of removing the veil where he says, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. There's a certain level of freedom that comes when we no longer have to hide behind the veil. There's a certain level of freedom that happens. And let's change the language because I think what most people might understand a little bit better is maybe not necessarily the language of veil, but let's use the language of mask. because a lot of us will mask ourselves. And I have spent years mastering the art of wearing masks. I have spent years curating masks because it was a way to protect myself because there was an underlying fear of rejection, an underlying fear of abandonment, where if I concealed who I really was, I could prevent people from walking away. Because if they really understood who I was, maybe they wouldn't stay, maybe they would leave. And so I developed mask after mask after mask after mask. And there's a scene from the movie The Dark Knight Rises with Christian Bale and Tom Hardy. And in the very beginning of the movie, Tom Hardy's character Bane is on the plane and he has a black hood over his face and he's carrying on a conversation. And the black hood is eventually removed from his head and it reveals a mask. And the next question that is asked is very, very profound and very powerful, even though it's in a Batman movie. If I take that off, will you die? And Bane's response was, it will be very painful. I think there are a lot of people who are willing to continue to hide behind and wear masks because they are unwilling to confront the pain that comes with the removal of those masks. Despite the fact
Yeah,
that the removal of masks produces freedom, or again, let's go back to that concept of where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. Despite the fact that there's a level of freedom that comes with the removal of the veil, the removal of the mask, we almost instinctively want to protect and preserve our pain because it's somehow more comfortable and more familiar to protect our pain than it is for us to actually confront it and let it go. What you said, I think, could not be truer because I think that there is this invitation that we are being given if we're willing to hear it, if we're willing to come to terms with it. It's this invitation to take off whatever masks you're wearing because masks have always and will always give a false sense of security and a false sense of identity. And you will never understand who you are or who you could become so long as you're willing to hide behind masks. And so Mitch, I want to touch on that. I want to touch on the concept of what you would call veil. I'm going to use the added word of masks because I think that there's a lot of people that hide behind masks because they're afraid of showing who they really are. And as a result, I would dare say that their identity actually suffers.
yeah, that's really interesting. I like what you were saying there about Moses coming down from the mountain and his face shone so bright that he had to veil himself. I think that's wonderful. That's so beautiful. I'd never heard that before. I really enjoyed that. Uh, yeah, there's two parts again. I think to this. Like the first thing that I would say is like, have you ever been to a masquerade ball? Have
I
you been
have
to
not.
like?
I know what they are. Yes.
Yeah. Or like a Halloween party, let's say. That's a better option,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Halloween parties are so much fun because you get to pretend to be a different character, which is real fun. You know, you can be the creepy clown or you can be the fun-loving whatever, and you can kind of see it very lightheartedly. And I think that's the first piece of the puzzle there. If we can recognize that we're wearing a mask and we recognize everybody else is wearing a mask, then we're just having a Halloween party right now. And I'm pretending I'm me and you're pretending you're you. You know what I mean? And what that does is that again alleviates so much pressure because then you're like, sweet, I'm just playing this character right now, and it also disentangles us a little bit from taking ourselves too seriously, which is nice. There's one whole path of yoga called karma yoga, which is all about selfless service of others. And that's one pathway to God because if you serve other people and you consider their issues more intensely than your own, you start to take your own issues less seriously, which is a nice way of starting to kind of loosen our attachment to our mask. So I think that's a really nice starting point where you can recognize, yep, I'm wearing a mask, and so is everybody else, and we're at a Halloween party, and that's kind of fun. And then the next part of the puzzle would be for each individual to kind of realize within themselves what's more uncomfortable for me. Is it more uncomfortable for me to continue to wear this mask, or is it more uncomfortable for me to take it off? And until we've reached a point where we don't have enough motivation to remove the mask, well, we're going to keep on wearing it. You know, there's almost like a carrot or a stick in this situation.
Mm.
The stick is your mask becomes so uncomfortable that you have to take it off. And that's how a lot of people will go down a spiritual path. And this is what this is, right? Regardless of what tradition you're using. Or you can start to get the sense, even while you're wearing your mask, that, hey, it might feel really good to take this mask off. And that's kind of the carrot, the dangling carrot of like, it could lead towards something that actually be really nice for me. But I think until we acknowledge the first piece of the puzzle, it's too tricky to take them off. It's too sticky because it's the identification with the mask that we have as being serious and being us and being completely entangled to who we are that creates the stickiness. I mean, just for that moment when we talked about it from a Halloween point of view, you, and so did I as well, felt a little bit of our mask come off to a certain degree
Right.
because it breaks it down. You're like, oh, that's right. Fuck, this is all good. This is all sweet.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a quote, and I don't even know if I want to call it a quote, but I saw it on Instagram multiple times, and it's Jim Carrey. And he was talking about depression, and he said, depression is what happens to the soul when we grow tired of pretending to be a character we thought we needed to be to survive.
Yeah, yeah.
And
That's a good way of putting it.
I thought it was so good because there's a lot of people who will speak negatively about depression. And if you study the etymology of the word, if you study the semantics of the word, at its core means to be pressed down or to be pressed under. And depression is not necessarily something that we need to come out of. Depression is something that is a mirror to ourselves that reveals a deeper truth. And more often than not, in order to quote unquote come out of depression, you have to actually go lower. You have to go deeper. And we've spent so much time medicating it. We've spent so much time trying to diagnose it. We've almost created a whole different category of people as quote unquote depressed people. And it's viewed as a stigma and it has a negative connotation. And yet I can't help but be consumed with Jim Carrey's thought where depression is what happens to the soul when we grow tired of becoming the character we thought we had to be in order to survive. And I think that that's something that a lot of people, including myself, have tried, right? Because to your point, when you talked about a Halloween party, there was this natural laughter. I couldn't help but smile. I couldn't help but laugh. I couldn't help but because there's some type of joy. There's a level of peace. There's a level of rest. There's a level of comfort that talks about or that comes from when we no longer have to hide. And I think
Yeah,
a lot of people have formed identities around survival. A lot of people have created masks around survival. And I almost feel like, even in this conversation, and for anybody that's listening, there is an invitation to, if you're experiencing depression, to not view it in a negative light or perhaps in the light that you have been taught or trained to understand it, but view it as a mirror and view it as the surface of the water that may be still and still enough to allow you to see the reflection. And once you see your reflection through the lens of depression, then you can go deeper and you can begin to understand what are those underlying issues that you are actually struggling with? What are those underlying emotions, those feelings that you have been unwilling and unable to confront? And I think this goes back to the concept of safety. I think this goes back to self acceptance. I think this goes back to compassion towards oneself because we have to give space for us to be honest be authentic, be genuine, be vulnerable, be sincere. And Mitch, those are things that I don't speak of from an expert standpoint. I am not an expert in authenticity. I am not an expert in being genuine. I am not an expert in sincerity. I am not an expert even in humility. And yet there's this humility and honesty. I'm going to use those words. There's a humility and honesty that we are being called to in light of everything that you and I have talked about so far. I can't help but wonder that there is this need within us to be humble. And when I say humble, I mean bring ourselves low because we spend so much time trying to make ourselves bigger and better than what we actually are. And as a result, we're
Yeah.
actually a detriment to ourselves where we need to, number one, be humble, number two, be honest. And only when we're willing to experience both of those realities at the same time are we able to then experience healing, because I think they produce healing. I think that they can produce growth. I think that they can produce maturity. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the
Yeah.
need for humility and honesty in providing safety for ourselves, but also in understanding our identity.
I think that is really, really good, Stephen. I strongly agree with you. Yeah, man. Like, if you consider social media, for instance, this is where a lot of people are getting their information these days. It is literally the opposite of authenticity and being humble. It's literally the opposite. And what people are trying to portray is their version that's going to allow them to kind of survive. So they're going to shape themselves to be whatever they need to be to project a particular image to get a particular outcome. And what that does is their authenticity online and tries to convince us that this particular way that we are ingesting is the way that we should be living our life. And if we're not meeting that standard, then we're not good enough. And
Mm,
honestly, it's fucking bullshit. Complete and utter bullshit. And it is like extremely toxic to our psyche. Extremely toxic. And I think this is probably the epidemic that we're going to face as a society in the next, 10, 20 years or whatever. The repercussions of that are yet to be seen, but obviously already starting. So what that does is that means that we're pretending to be a certain way so we can try and project a particular image, which is hiding us from being authentic and constantly reinforcing to us that our particular version of who we are is not okay. And so then we're holding ourselves in this pattern of self-rejection, trying to fit others' expectations, when in reality, those people are doing the same exact thing. And so it's their own self-rejection that is trapping other people within the self-rejection. You see what I'm saying, right?
mhm,
And the reality of the situation is like you, Stephen, you're a good dude. You're a nice guy. You're fine. You're fine just the way you are. You know what I mean? And you taking pressure off and just being like, what happens if I just act the way that I am? It's really funny because we'll have moments in our earlier life that maybe that wasn't okay to do that and we got shut down for expressing ourselves from our parents or whatever the particular mechanism is. But particularly as we become adults, you start to realize that you're actually in charge of your own life. And the people around you are going to come to you based on what you're giving out. And it's much easier to give out who you really are rather than shape it to be a particular way. Because if you shape it, you have to maintain it to be a particular way. And that is fucking exhausting. That
mm,
is not a good option because that just chips away at who we are. But the reality is, for you, Stephen, you're already a good dude. You're already a good guy. And if you let out this honest, authentic part of who you are, which is a practice we can do over time, you're going to attract the people that are attracted to you, not attracted to the mask that you're portraying. And what that does is it's a self-fulfilling thing where you end up with people that you genuinely enjoy being around because they allowed you to be you.
mhm,
And they like being around you because they genuinely like you. And that allows them to be who they are because they're seeing that you're being very authentic about who you are. And it creates this cycle of authenticity, which feels way better than 100,000 followers on Instagram ever could. You know,
mm,
like you can have a whole bunch. I had a post recently that went like, it was like 3 million something or other, right? And I'm very small on Instagram because I'm not particularly organized enough for it, to be honest. But it was like, when that happened, it was like, man, this feels kind of bad. And it really kind of did feel kind of bad. I mean, I have to still advertise through Instagram, but it did not feel good in the slightest. You know,
Mm,
it just felt like, what's happening right now? All of a sudden there's like 3 million people who are paying attention to this little clip that I put up there. Like, that's insanity. That is literally like insanity. And so this is the repercussion of that we can feel within ourselves. It's like, fuck, man, like what happens if you try and open yourself and be authentic? It feels vulnerable because you might get harmed, but each time you actually do that, you'll realize piece by piece that there's nothing that can be harmed. That thing that we talked about earlier, that silent state that's closer to our true nature is unchangeable. It can't be harmed. And so as we get closer to that, our ability to open up and be more vulnerable about who we really are becomes easier. Um, and I haven't perfected it either. Like, I'm still just doing my best and all the rest. But like, no, I deeply know that authenticity is the thing that actually uh, is and adds value to your life. There's
mm.
so many things that people will achieve and they won't give you that feeling because it's not deeply authentic to who you really are. Like I've got a good friend of mine who's an international lecturer on death and dying and Buddhism. He's a professor of medicine. He was telling me about how when he's also gay, and when he was getting to the point where he was able to truly express who he really was, it meant so much more to him than all these international accolades. You know, it was something that was like fundamentally true to him. So, for me, I had to step away from academia because I couldn't be deeply true to who I was. And I had the opportunity to. I had a pathway with a new career that would be able to support me. So I can't overemphasize enough the value of authenticity. That and that can be a practice of just trying. What happens if I kind of let out how I really feel? What happens
Yeah.
if I don't judge myself for everything that I'm saying, or you know what I mean? Like try and shape it to be alongside this person who I'm trying to emulate or whatever. What if I just kind of let it roll and see what happens? It's a nice feeling, and I know it's hard,
Uh,
dude. I know it's hard. I'm not saying this is easy, right? Because these habits are friggin' entrenched, and that's why a religious practice or a spiritual practice or a meditation practice, from what I teach, that's the way for you to progressively it becomes easier bit by bit to be able to do these sorts of things.
I think,
Stephen, like, what if you were a really good dude? You know what I mean? Like, what if
yeah,
you were already a really good dude? And like an enjoyable guy, and you have all these people who have already been attracted to you because of who you are, then you can kind of go, okay, if I'm already a good dude, what if I just take the pressure off myself to be something else?
yeah.
You know, it's a nice feeling.
I think there's an epidemic, and I'm going to describe it as an epidemic of image. We
Yeah,
came
yeah,
through a global pandemic 5 years ago, and the pandemic forced a lot of people inside their homes. You were no longer able to engage in community. You were no longer engaged in social interaction. You had to practice safe distance from other people. Coincidentally, you had to wear a mask. Interestingly
yeah,
enough, you had to wear a mask, and as a result, a lot of people were not only forced inside of their homes, but they were forced inside of another world. The only way that I can describe it is with a trilogy that was released years ago that just experienced a recent release, and it's the movie The Matrix. And there's a lot of people that, as a result of their limited social interaction, now they were forced inside of a virtual world. And this is where Instagram began to take off. This is where Facebook began to take off. This is where TikTok began to take off. This is where a lot of platforms right now and a lot of what we would call influencers began and got their start. And that's why now, as a result, they perhaps have all the followers that they do because we were consuming and consuming and consuming. And what I think is one of the greatest dilemmas and the greatest dangers to social media is this epidemic of image. where what we are presenting to the world is not our identity. What we are presenting to the world is our image. And there is a drastic, drastic difference between image and identity. Image is something that can be curated. Image is something that can be created. Image is something that changes all the time. It changes on environment. It changes on circumstances. It changes on relationship. It can be impacted and affected by so many different external variables that more often than not, you wonder what the actual purpose of the image actually is. However, identity is something that is not created. Identity is what you are born with. Identity is who you are. Identity is who you are when you're lying in your bed at night with no one else around, or even if you're married and your spouse or your partner is laying next to you. Identity is who you are at your very core. Identity is when you look at yourself in the mirror and ask the question, who am I? That is not a question of image. That is a question of identity. And we have created an epidemic of image with social media, where now one of the greatest detriments and dangers to image is this comparison, where not only are we not being kind to ourselves, not only are we not being compassionate towards ourselves, not only are we not being gracious to ourselves, but now we're comparing ourselves to other people because images feed off of each other. My image, if I'm not careful, can feed off of someone else's image. Their image can feed off of my image. Their image can feed off somebody, and it creates, like you talked about earlier, this vicious cycle. There can almost be this epidemic of image that produces this cycle of comparison, where now all of these images are being created, and we've created a masquerade ball within social media. We've created a Halloween ball, a Halloween party in social media, where everybody, you wonder if what you're getting, despite how many likes or reposts or shares or comments or follows, you wonder if what you're seeing is the image or the identity. And so, as we bring this conversation to a close, I think that that's probably where I want to land the plane. I want to land the plane with the difference between image and identity, and the what I would call the epidemic of image versus the necessity of identity. And I think that's how I'm going to frame it. The epidemic of image versus the necessity of identity.
Yeah, I think that you're right, that there is this real epidemic of image, and I think that's a really good way of putting it. I think that in time, people will realize the cost of pretending.
Mhm.
There's a cost to yourself of pretending, and often people won't get it until they're older. You won't reap what you sowed earlier on until you're older. And the difficulty is that, particularly with social media, it's the young generation who are creating the majority of the content. And so when they get to the point that they've realized the difficulty they've caused themselves, there'll be a new younger generation to take their place and make the same mistakes again. So it's almost like technology is amplifying our capacity to get caught in this cycle, which is, it's going to cause all sorts of problems. Yeah. I mean, this is a very, very difficult time for humanity that we're facing, and we're all going to be trapping ourselves in these ideas of image. And the further that we start to identify ourselves with our image, the more difficulty we're going to cause ourselves. And that is completely and utterly true. If you have to pretend so much that who you are is a complete fabrication compared to who you really are, that has such a cost associated with it. You have you been to a function before where you have to wear a tuck tie and you have to make sure that you appear a particular way to the people that you're with?
Yep.
After that function, you don't feel better, you know? It's
Yeah.
yeah. If you're living your life that way, It's gonna cost. There's gonna be a cost, and the cost is that you're gonna miss out on your life,
Mm,
miss
it's
out on
good.
the authentic experience of your own life, and no one else is gonna pay the price. You're gonna be the one who pays the price. Because when it comes down to it, we're all gonna die, and when you're sitting there and you have the realization that this whole thing is over, and you were pretending the whole time, that is a pain that I can't express. It is something beyond what people will conceive. You know, I've worked with a fair amount of people as they die and all this sort of stuff. And there's been some people that I've worked with that have had like life crushing regret because of how they have pretended their whole life. And it's a deeply sad thing, but it's almost like these are the traps that us humans we get ourselves into. We just have technology to make the trap more obvious now, I think.
Mm.
Yeah, Stephen, thank you so much for this conversation. Hey, I really enjoyed talking with you. Um, and I appreciate your perspective, particularly in how you related Christianity to some of the stuff I was talking about. I love that. That's great.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming on. I have learned a lot. And again, you came highly recommended by Todd. And so, again, any friend of Todd is a friend of mine. And so I consider you as a friend. I consider you as a brother. Consider this a formal invitation for a second round and for further conversation. I think we've only scratched the surface. And so I would love to have you back on. But Mitch, I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for coming on and having the conversation with me.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.